everybody. Welcome to the Next 2020. My name is Gabriela Heizer, and I'm your show for this host on the Boca Raton Tribune. Today, we're going to be talking about the tech industry. I think that's very important with everything we have going on, to know a little bit about the industry itself, how you get in the industry, and current events going on. So I'd like to introduce you to our guest. We have Veronica.
Hi.
Hey. Eduardo.
Hello.
And Surya.
Hey, everyone.
Hi, guys. Thank you for being on the show, first off. So to get us started, I wanted us to go around the virtual room and tell the audience where you work, what you do there, and what brought you to your current company. So, Surya, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I actually recently graduated from college, and I currently work as a software engineer at Salesforce out in San Francisco. Yeah, it's been kind of a fun experience thus far. It's the school I went to, Berkeley, was pretty geared towards technology and everything, and most of the people that you talk to were in that entire world. And originally, I ended up not coming in as a computer science major, and I feel like the environment kind of influenced me in a good way to jump into it, and I haven't looked back since. It's been a lot of fun.
That's awesome. Veronica, why don't you go next?
Hi, my name is Veronica Weiss, and I recently graduated with a bachelor's in computer science. I work now at a Fortune 500 company in the financial industry. I've always been comfortable around computers. I've been dealing with programming languages from just like Java when I was like 12 to like learning JavaScript and Python in high school, and then I got focused more on cybersecurity as my niche in computer science, and the company I work for really allowed me to have freedom and learn a lot as I grow on the job. So I think it was just really great to have a company that allowed me to have so many responsibilities so soon and continue learning just different areas in the niche I wanted to learn more about in computer science.
That's awesome. Eduardo?
Hi, my name's Eduardo Dombrowiski. I work as a software engineering manager at Bleacher Report, sports media company. Headquarters for the engineering team is out in San Francisco, but we're a distributed team. I'm in Fort Lauderdale, and we have our team members across the entire country and some outside the country as well. I've always been super interested in computers, and I've always liked the puzzles that you end up solving when working with computers. So I started off in mobile app development, and eventually I wanted to change into more of the back end side of things and infrastructure. So been at Bleacher Report for 7 years, and I've done all sorts of things over there, and I like that. I've had so many opportunities over there, and doing so many things, and also like operating at a pretty large scale was always interesting to me. So that's what drew me there.
That's awesome. I love how you guys all are in different phases in the tech industry and are in different sectors, I guess, of the tech industry because of the different companies you work at. So this should be a fun discussion because we have a bunch of different inputs all within the same industry. So I think that's awesome. So what has been your biggest challenge in the industry, and how were you able to overcome it? So Veronica, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think just, well, first off, everyone talks about like being a woman, one in computer science, and like that's such an exhaustive conversation, but I don't really think people talk about like why that's so important, even at like a young age in academia. Most of the classes are men, and especially in high school when like boys don't really know how to like even communicate that well. It's always just harder because the boys then work together, and just for women I've seen, then they become more isolated and leave the field, which is really disheartening. And then in the industry-wise, relationships and social interactions are so important. And then sometimes, especially in a niche like computer security, where it's 95 to 98% male most of the time, there can be some boundaries that can easily be breached or something like that. But I'm really happy to now work with such an encouraging team. And part of like finding your place in the industry is kind of growing up and realizing that even if you're in a place where you're uncomfortable, like it does get better. And like you find more people who are willing to empower you.
That's awesome. It's a great perspective. Eduardo, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the big challenges for me was coming from a non-traditional background. So I started with my college education, but once I got into the workforce as a software engineer, I decided to pause on my education, and I just never came back. And in some ways, it gives me an advantage because I can communicate certain concepts in ways that people that are not as technical can understand, and that's a pretty powerful tool when you work in the tech industry. But on the other hand, it's a big disadvantage because when you're talking about more in-depth concepts, sometimes I'm interacting with people that have learned about this a lot in school and went really deep into it, and sometimes I don't have that depth of knowledge, which means I have to catch up and take do a lot of reading on my own and figure out how all these concepts work, and sometimes I have the time to do that, but sometimes it's just on the spot and someone brings up something that's really a concept that I'm not familiar with. So I just kind of have to pull together everything that I know from different places and try to piece it together. So that's definitely a big challenge in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I have experienced something somewhat similar to Eduardo in that sense. For me, at least, my biggest challenge has been imposter syndrome within the tech industry. And I think that, what's kind of frustrating is that, especially as someone that is just getting started off in the industry, being surrounded by so many smart people on a regular basis, and even in school, going to, a well-respected school in that regard, where everyone's kind of expected to come out and be very, very good at what they do, and then coming into the industry and realizing that I actually know nothing, and it's kind of a weird position to be in because I know that I'm here to learn. I'm kind of constantly trying to improve myself, but then the expectations put on you, or at least the perceived expectations, at least, where you're supposed to be better than this, you're supposed to know what you're doing. Kind of put me in kind of a bind, and so I feel like it's slowly kind of been a learning process to learn that it's okay to not have all the answers all the time, and kind of get better as days go on, right?
Yeah, definitely. So you guys talked a lot about your struggles because that was the question. Yeah, but what are some strengths that you think are important to be successful in the tech industry?
I think resilience is a big one, regardless of where you're coming from. I think whether it is because you don't understand the material or whether you just are constantly overloaded by how talented your teammates are. I think just saying that I might not know this right now, or I might not be doing something that I should be doing right now, but as long as I keep plugging away, eventually it will turn out okay. I think is one of the biggest things that I have found is something that helps me out.
Something that going off based off of that, resilience is a really great point for being a software developer or working in tech. And knowing when to reach out to people is really important. You can know what you know, but you won't ever know what you won't know until it comes up in a meeting or at a point where you have to know. So I think it's really important to try and exhaust all the options and knowledge you have, but reaching out to people is really important. And humility can sometimes be hard to come by in certain tech teams. So I think it's really important to kind of stay humble, kind of have some self-evaluation and know that you won't know everything, but that's okay. We're all here to learn and do it together, and we'll all be competent together.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I always try to approach everything as a student, and when I'm approaching problems, I realizing that I may not know all the answers, especially now, getting into management. I really rely on my team to be the tech experts. So I'll come to them with problems and, possible solutions. And I always try to, even before being a manager, I would always approach things and say, basically, hey, this is the problem. Here's what I think the solution is. These are the assumptions that I'm making. And a lot of times, you make these assumptions and they're wrong, and you have to realize that. And if you come in assuming that your assumptions are all correct and you have the right answer, sometimes that's not as well received, or sometimes people will just let you run and fail, and that can be bad as well. So I always try to approach it as like, hey, like, this is what I'm thinking. Like, what do you think? Like, what do you think of this assumption? And there's always going to be people that know more than you.
Right.
So a lot of introspection, and also a lot of times, like, one thing that I think has really helped me probably the most in my career is to take a step back and think about what's really important. And a lot of times, especially in the tech industry, there's a tendency to think that everything is a tech problem. And one thing that I like to say is, programming is not a math problem, it's a communication problem most of the time. So a lot of times we're looking for technical solutions to problems, and sometimes, like, there really isn't one, and the solution is like, hey, like, maybe we should approach the way that we communicate to our team members differently, and that's the solution to the problem, and it's not a piece of code that you write. So I think that's always really good to think about, and just think about what the business is and what's the main goal of the business, and try to further that. Because I could write like the most pristine and cool piece of code that that I could write, but like, if it doesn't provide business value, it's like, okay, like, I'm thinking that I'm doing great, but my boss is like, okay, like, this, like, it's cool, but now what? So I think it's always good to step back and think about what's the biggest problem that the business needs to be solved, and then work on that.
Wow, that's so interesting. I never would have thought about that. I think in my head, like, as outside of the field, I view tech as very tech wise, and I've never realized how it correlates like that. And that's awesome. It's great input. I wanted to ask you guys, I know earlier with the earlier question, we were talking about education wise and how, like, the different backgrounds and how education impacted your career choice and your moving up in the career and things like that. So I wanted to kind of discuss what you guys think if you guys think the education system, specifically like kindergarten through 12th grade, but also colleges if you want, but do they do enough to teach students the importance of tech?
I think especially in K to 12, it's kind of flawed as it is. Something that I realized going from just high school to college and college to industry is that there's such a focus on having students who are at a young age mathematically inclined push towards computer science, and they kind of leave out a lot of other students who could also be really great at that field. And I think that there's a huge issue with not looking at students who excel in language classes, because the skills that come with naturally being able to conjugate are similar skills to knowing how to naturally navigate through different program language syntax. So I think it would be really beneficial to also reach out to students who aren't just gifted especially at math at a young age, and push them into computer science too. And I think then you could also have a more diverse workforce, because I think it's as in elementary school or middle school, if you're just pushing mathematically inclined kids towards computer science, you miss out on giving a lot of the other kids the same opportunity.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm actually interested in seeing like what you guys think, because I'm a little bit later in my career, so I'm sort of an old man in the room here. But I think that, especially with technology, it's a really tricky situation, because I think everyone knows that it's important, but I just don't think the resources are there to act on it. Because especially in the tech industry, right? It's like, if you want to get someone that's really going to be an excellent resource for students, if they're that skilled, instead of making a teacher salary, they can make 5 times a teacher salary and just work in the industry. So it's really hard to get people that are qualified to show these students what's possible. So what I found when I was in middle school and high school, whenever we had these types of classes, it was definitely like, guidance counselors and things like that, they would always say like, yeah, like this is super important, this is the future. But then you would go and take the class, and if you had any motivation, you could basically surpass what your teachers were doing like pretty easily. So I graduated high school in 2008, so that was there wasn't really like this the amount of online learning resources that there are today. So I think that online learning that is definitely something that that can help with this, because you can spread the cost of a really good education across millions of students, instead of having someone that you have to pay, like if you wanted to get something really good, you got to pay them a lot of money, and like they can only teach like 100 students, maybe tops. So I think, yes, like everyone knows that it's an important thing, but I think the resources, at least when I was in middle school and high school, they just weren't there, because like you could go work in the industry for like 5 times as much money.
Yeah, I think both of you guys hit on something that I have been pretty interested recently. This idea of the digital divide, and how different economic classes, different genders, different people kind of have different access to tech literacy, right? And it's something that I think is slowly changing, not fast enough, but it's definitely changing slowly, I think. In the sense that, when I was growing up, and I graduated 2015 from high school, and so when I was growing up, social media and like smartphones were really just kind of starting to take hold in everyone's day-to-day life. I mean, it was definitely prevalent, but not nearly as prevalent as it is right now. There are kids like significantly younger than me right now who have smartphones, and I got my first smartphone when I was, I don't know, in my sophomore year of high school, I think, something like that. And my little brother's had one since he was in the 6th or 7th grade. And so, I feel like as more and more people kind of are growing up with smartphones, social media, different kinds of tech, they're kind of inadvertently kind of inculcated into all of this stuff. And even though, the traditional K through 12 system does have tons of flaws in teaching tech literacy, people are just kind of learning on their own, because a lot of things kind of, Instagram, for example, right? Instagram or Facebook or whatever you normally use day to day, they kind of teach you how to interact with technology in a way that classes really don't try to, nor will they teach, And so, and on top of that, tech, I think, is one of those few industry, or few kind of subjects, computer science, one of those few subjects where you can teach yourself if you are given the right mentorship and the right, I guess, you're in the right environment, right? And so I think that looking for solutions in the K through 12 space might actually not be the best solution. I think having mentors, people that are in the industry coming into all kinds of communities to say, hey, well, listen, this is what you could potentially do. This is what this is how you could learn how to be more involved in this community, I think is actually a very good, maybe a bit more of an indirect path to teaching tech literacy, I think.
Interesting. So my question to that comment would be, how would you get people connected to tech mentors? Because like you were talking about, not everyone has the same access to those types of things. So what would you implement, incorporate into the curriculum to maybe not teach it, but maybe get students mentor or teach it, depending, you know what I mean? How would you incorporate that? Yeah,
it's a good question. I think a lot of this stuff is very systemic in terms of how we build it, right? There are a couple organizations that are pretty cool. Code 2040 is a cool one that brings in underrepresented or historically people that are not in tech normally, right? Latino and African-American communities into the tech industry, right? And by doing that, you have people that are now kind of involved in the space, and they can go back to their siblings or their friends and say, hey, well, listen, this is how you can kind of get involved a bit better, right? I think it's also just conversation. A lot of people in the tech industry that I know really don't have too much of a window into why the digital divide might exist, right? I think just conversations, talking to people, understanding how their experiences might be different than yours, I think is like a major way to at least get the ball rolling on this.
Mm-hmm. I think also on a local level, there's so many local tech communities. In Palm Beach County, there's Palm Beach Tech. I think there was like Wynwood Hacks or something for a while in Miami. I think if people saw it as more of a local issue, and if the local tech groups actually reached out to schools or elementary schools or middle schools and even put on 20 half-an-hour workshops or even just presentations on like basic programming or coding things, even just describing what they do at work. I think that would inspire a lot of kids, and it would be an easy connection to have. So I think definitely something that could help is if local tech chapters actually reached out to schools.
Yeah. Awesome. So how has the pandemic impacted your guys' careers personally and also the tech industry as a whole?
I think the tech industry is doing pretty well in the pandemic, honestly. It's one of the few places or few industries that hasn't really been, well, I mean, it hasn't been touched to the same degree as others, I think. You have your outliers, like Airbnb and Uber and Lyft, I think. But for the most part, because everyone is now working from home and everyone has to be doing things digitally, the need for more software products, I think, has risen.
Yeah, I think that, and I'm actually looking at the live comments, and someone just asked a question about concentration of opportunities in high cost regions. So I was living in the Bay Area for 7 years, and I just moved back to Florida, and my company is pretty much we started going remote and having those opportunities about 2 years ago. And so we were already equipped to work that way. So, it was, now that everyone has to work remote, it was just, it was a pretty easy transition for all of us. And I think for a lot of different companies that thought, maybe this would never be a thing for them, now it has to be a thing. So, either everyone works from home or you just don't work at all. So, you kind of have to do it. And I think that's going to open up opportunities across, the entire country. So, we have people in all different time zones across the country. We have a few engineers in Brazil. We have a couple in Kenya and Egypt. So we have people all over, and we all communicate through the internet, which is everywhere. So you can kind of do it from everywhere. So it didn't affect us that much, that way, because we were already equipped to do it. But I can see how a lot of different companies that they could do it before, but they just there was some hesitation. Now they can do it. As far as business is concerned, I work for a sports company, and there's no more sports, which is definitely a scary thing. But overall, our strategy looks so far ahead, into the next 2 to 5 years, that we're not working on that many things that rely on the NBA playoffs happening when they usually happen, and things like that. Obviously, there's not as much revenue, but really, our strategy is such long term that we're still doing the same work that we were going to do anyways.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Similar to what was just touched on, I think that obviously more companies will be comfortable to have remote jobs. My company has already had offices in Costa Rica and Mumbai for employees to work in. So I think that the turn to having global areas or non-concentrated areas has been happening for a bit, but not as much as it should be. And hopefully, one good thing from the pandemic is that more people can work remotely. But on the flip side of that, there's less humanizing experiences. And working in tech, it's like what was said before in this call, it's a really people-based problem. So even if you work in remote, you might be locked out of a situation or a phone call, or you can't track down a person to get an answer from. Sometimes you have something you need to get ready by a deadline, and just sometimes you have to go to one person to kind of have a decision made, and now it's harder to do. And also, working in such a technical field, it's really important to be able to go over and get coffee or something with a coworker. And now just having those less humanizing experiences can really be harmful for the software development process, because you might not know what someone's specialty or interest is to help you with a question, the same way you would be able to explore other colleagues in the office.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely something that you need to be on the lookout for, because it's very easy to get isolated. You have to be way more proactive about it. there are still like some ways, like, earlier today, I had a coworker that was like, "Hey, like, I just need to vent. Like, do you want to grab a beer?" And he grabbed a beer in Atlanta, and I grabbed a beer here in Fort Lauderdale, and we got on a video call, and we drank a beer, and we talked to each other. It's definitely, but it's way harder than just like stopping by someone's desk and being like, "Hey, like, let's talk." So you have to be, careful to not to not be so isolated.
Definitely. And we have a comment from Natalia. She said, I know Eddie kind of talked about it, but if you guys want to add anything, Natalia asked, what are your thoughts on the concentration of tech opportunities in certain high-cost regions? And as a nation, how can we reduce bubbles and expand opportunities to other regions? So if you guys have any input on that.
I think it's already kind of happening.
Oh, no, sorry. You go. I just want.
I think it's already kind of happening in the sense that the Bay Area, like Natalia mentioned, is absurdly expensive, right? And as soon as the pandemic hit, I know most of the people that I am friends with, most of the people that I work with left the city because why pay an obscene amount of rent when you could live, a couple miles out and pay half or even quarter what you're paying right now, or move out of state. I have friends that went out to Utah and go hiking while they're working,
That's awesome.
Like a cabin out there and just go and just work remotely and then go on hikes in the evening, or even during the daytime. So I think as we realize that remote work becomes more and more valid and more just feasible, right? I think it just becomes more realistic to not be in these high cost, high density bubbles. And if people like the outdoors, they'll go out there. If they like the suburbs, they'll go out there, right? It's much more scalable now.
But yeah, like you said, everything's moving more remotely, especially younger people, I think, would rather live somewhere with lower taxes or like where they can just be outside more. I had an opportunity with the Big Five earlier this year, and I turned it down just because I could not live in San Francisco. It's way too high, and I'm living in New York now. Like that's saying a lot of turning down like a place like San Francisco because of rent. And I think that it's going to be interesting what happens with companies moving to places that aren't concentration hubs too, because I think companies are going to have to be careful of the economic effect and the cultural effect they'll have on communities going from these centralized hubs to more maybe suburban areas. Hopefully they'll be able to like integrate the culture well and just be able to foster and uphold everyone. But I think that most of the tech companies and opportunities being in centralized hubs have kind of been a systemic issue. It's based on like old economic systems in play with only a few cities really contributing to the economy in certain technological advancement ways. And hopefully they'll be able to reach out to more suburban areas and lower cost places so it can be more accessible for everyone. But I think that will be a system that people will actually have to get local people's input on it as well. And I hope that executives would reach out to local communities.
Yeah, definitely. And I know you guys were talking about, clearly the pandemic has sped up the use of technology in different businesses. Do you think that's a step in the right direction, or do you think it was like too fast that they needed to think this out? Like, what do you guys think about that?
I think it was bound to happen anyways. I think we were already on the path to doing that. And now with the pandemic, for example, brick and mortar stores were already on their way out, right? Amazon absolutely eviscerated them. And so I think now with the pandemic going around, delivery services, online shopping, everything has just been shifted online much faster in a much more efficient way because of necessity. It wasn't going to happen otherwise at the same pace. And I think that because it did shift, we know that it's possible. And there are definitely kinks that need to be worked out, I think. Nothing is perfect right off the bat, right? But I think it's a step in the right direction, or in a direction at least. And I think only time will tell how effective it really is in the long run.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely, accelerated something that was already happening. And a lot of it is some good side effects, like everyone that can work from home is now working from home, which means there are fewer cars on the road and there's less pollution and, things like that. And like road wear and like all these kinds of things, that we've been accustomed to, since the beginning of time. Like if you're going to work, you have to go somewhere to work, and now you no longer have to do that. So I'm really interested in all of that, and how even, you know, new cities will be developed, and new areas of cities, right? Because if you have fewer people that are going out to these hubs where you work, and then you come back to these hubs where you live, and then you go to the place where you get your entertainment, you know, maybe there will be like closer communities where people just live and work and get their entertainment kind of like in the same place, and there's a bigger sense of community. So that was, you know, when this whole thing started, that was my hope, that like this type of thing would be accelerated. And, you know, like now you no longer need, you know, like if you have multiple people in a household, now you only need one car, and you don't even drive that car that much. So this type of thing, I think is, you know, I think it's going to be a change. I think like interesting to think even like architecture, like what it's going to be in the future, you know, like now you need a bedroom for you and your partner, and you need, you know, a bedroom for your kids, but now you also need a home office. Like, how is that going to change things? So all sorts of different things. Like now I saw the other day, there are companies that are doing these converted shipping containers that you put in your backyard, and that's an office. So you can still like go to the office, but in reality, it's just a shipping container in your backyard. So like all these types of changes that, you know, like we don't really think about, and we were already going that way, but it's just much more accelerated.
Yeah.
That's interesting. You mentioned the architecture thing, because I was reading a blog post the other day that was talking about how more places might have copper doorknobs because that has less bacteria apparently on it. But I think it's a good thing that there are more remote jobs happening. I think it'll be really interesting from a scalability standpoint for these systems to see how long they can be sustainable at, with so many users hitting it all at once. Even AWS or Google Cloud's platform has gone down at least once. And I can't imagine like what it would be like if Zoom went down for a day, or Outlook or any other device that people really rely on now, because they don't have any face-to-face value.
Right.
So seeing something like that would be, just from like a social aspect, interesting, but you know, I think that could also do a lot of damage, especially on critical infrastructure or anything that really needs people to be on 24-hour systems. So there's like pros and cons of both being remote, but hopefully nothing would crash, and hope everything stays scalable.
Right. And what I was thinking of specifically was all these schools that switched online. Like my school, I think, was a little bit more prepared than most, but like they weren't nearly as prepared to switch everyone online, both the school-wise and their systems, and also, like you mentioned, everyone having the same access to the same internet. Like not everyone did, and my school did different things to try to get everyone on the same playing field. But I think that sudden shift, no one was ready for, at least like at my school personally. So that's interesting that you mentioned that. I agree.
So schools are a whole nother issue.
Yeah. And now though that we switched online, do you think that that's going to help maybe more people in education system, both like K through 12 and onwards, like be more interested in the tech industry? Like, do you think that's going to help create a push and a surge in that industry?
I think it'll normalize it more, right? I think, you know, when we were growing up, it was much more like, you know, only the geniuses or the smart kids, the math kids going to math, right? Now
That's
it's like,
why I never went.
don't say that. But, you know, I think now it's part of the landscape. And so everyone's like, oh, well, it's just Zoom, you know, or it's just Facebook, or it's just whatever. And people will be like, oh, I can go build it as well. I've used it my entire life. So why can't I contribute to it? Right? It's almost the attitude. My little brother has something very similar to that, right? He grew up with Instagram, I mean, in a different manner than I did. And so it's just, like I said, it's part of the landscape now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think like students are going to be less interested in school, honestly. Private institutions might lose a lot of students because it might not be worth the tuition. Public institutions will, I mean, if like students don't have to go to school, like, I mean, like they probably won't like do their work. They'll hang out with their friends because they're missing the social aspect. And then hopefully like people like could just Google like some coding stuff, like if they feel like they need to be productive or learn a trade. And I think that there should really be a normalized concept of like going into computer science just to get the money sometimes. Sometimes it's like, oh, you have to love it and you're greedy if you want the money. But especially now, with being like, I can't imagine being a high school student and having all your classes cut, and still needing to make money, of course. So hopefully there'll be more tech literacy through this too.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, like it's just accelerating something that was already happening. And, with more and more things going online, like I said before, around like the tech education in the K through 12, you can create a really good curriculum and spread that cost across, all students in the United States. Which means you can have the best curriculum and you can have really good training for everyone. So I think it's going to definitely increase the access. Maybe 20 years ago you had to be really privileged to have this type of opportunity. And if you look back, 30 years ago and 40 years ago, like to even have a computer, that was such a crazy thing to think about. And, like some people did, and, they were really successful. And you think about, people like Bill Gates, it's like people like to tell this story of like how he's, like a self-made, like young, like tech, entrepreneur. But in reality, he had all these resources available to him, and people don't really like talking about that, but he was, like the 1% of the 1%, even before, like being Bill Gates, so now you don't need as much of that anymore, which I think is going to bring a lot more equality to different things. Like obviously there's always going to be, like certain advantages that, more wealthy people have. But it's definitely the gap in this particular area is definitely decreasing.
Yeah, definitely. And what do you guys think the future of technology is going to look like? Clearly it's not going anywhere and we're depending more and more on it. What do you think the future is going to look like for technology in both in the industry specifically and also in different businesses?
I think tech as a service is already it's already a pretty big thing, right? So I think the future is kind of in much more in that direction. AWS is a really cool model where it's pay as you go, right? So the more you use their service, the more you pay. The gig economy, right? Uber, DoorDash, Uber Eats, all these things are kind of like, we don't need to have like a perpetual service going back and forth. It's just whenever you want it, you pay for it and you'll get it, right? And technology allows that, this kind of on-demand kind of service, right? The idea of on-demand services, right? And it makes it accessible to everyone. And I think that as we get better and better at building this technology, more and more of these problems will pop up where problems and kind of availabilities as well, right? Opportunities, I think, will kind of grow more and more prevalent. And I think it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that, as more tech gets built, more of these services get built out. And then the tech will fill in spaces to fill those requirements again.
Mm-hmm.
I read this really interesting book a while back called Prediction Machines, and it talks about machine learning and how how it's going to affect the future. And it had a pretty interesting take on it, because whenever people think of machine learning and artificial intelligence, they think about these basically these black boxes that will just do everything for us. And this approaches it in a much different way, where it's a tool that will allow people to operate differently. So I think the revolution that we're having in terms of machine learning and what can be done with that is definitely going to have a big effect on the future. And it's really going to have an effect on what it's like to be a human. There are going to be certain things that we just don't need to really think about anymore. And we're going to be able to think about other things, and nobody really knows what that's going to bring. But it's pretty exciting. It's like one of the analogies from the book is that machine learning is almost like electricity, right? It's not a single product, so to speak, but it's just this utility that just enabled such a huge like explosion of other technology. So, for example, you could only read during the day. Like you could only have like certain things during the day because of daylight, but now you have electricity. You can do things at night now, and that like unlocks just like a lot of human potential. And machine learning is something like that, where it's just gonna allow us to just be different as humans, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Going based off of what was just said with AWS and machine learning. One thing that's interesting is, 3 years ago, AWS was in control of like 42% of the cloud market, and then Google and Azure were both like in the 30%. I would love to see like what that looks like now, if there's been any new studies on how much AWS has consisted of the cloud market. And if you think about it, that's like a huge monopoly to have for the internet and infrastructure on the internet from one company for the entire world. So I'm really curious to see like what legislation will happen with Amazon Web Services and the whole conversation with data warehouses in general. Like there should be more conversations about the landlords of that area. There should be more conversations about how is it like one company, like what will the market be for that at all? Because it's such important infrastructure. And if you look at just critical infrastructure, like in electricity or water, there's like some competition at least. There's definitely monopolies or more giant players, but it's interesting that AWS is so prevalent for the internet. And another thing that would just be interesting for AWS security right now is focuses so much on like web applications or like on operating systems. Right now, there's very few ways, such as like side channel attacks, to get into like cloud infrastructure, which is very rare and very risky, or network attacks. And so I think it'll be interesting to see what comes out of people trying to attack cloud infrastructure more so. And I think that more companies will invest in kind of configuring their cloud infrastructure more. And I think on the machine learning side, it's interesting too, because, well, you can think of like AI as something that like is really important to be scared about now. Like Elon Musk has talked about certain fears, and like Kanye has as well. And it gets perpetrated like from kids down to a young age, thinking that Skynet will happen soon. But if you look at it, like, yes, you can play Go, but machine learning hasn't really advanced that much. Even about a few months ago, there was a robotic hand that could solve a Rubik's Cube, but then it turned out that those methods were fraudulent. And there is a really good researcher and author in AI called Gary Marcus, and his whole career is kind of creating a realistic expectations for AI. And I think something that we should be scared about with AI, though, is how much data replication policies are failing to protect United States citizens and citizens all over. People will always talk about like how TikTok is dangerous on your phone and taking too much information, but Facebook, Reddit, a ton of other messaging systems that people use are like listening, and like just what's going on with natural language processing is really scary. Like you can talk about something and get ads for it. And yeah, that's kind of nice sometimes, but also at the same time, like that's something that hopefully will be like, talked about more in a political light.
Yeah, definitely. And you guys talked about two things that I definitely want us to touch about a little bit today is both data and automation. So regarding data, like you brought up TikTok and how they use that, but I also know like Zoom, like they're not very good at protecting your data, right? So what are your thoughts on how companies are gathering information on their app and getting data? And is there really any protections for users?
So at least with Zoom, what's the good and hopeful is that once the whole Zoom bugs got released, Zoom hired a ton of security companies that are really well known for penetration testing and code reviews. So like it's like everyone has been kind of like poking at holes on it. So it's probably really secure now.
Now, yeah.
And there's a lot of configurations, and the Zoom messaging system isn't enabled at my company, and that alone gets rid of a lot of like cross-site scripting or any weird malicious links that a user could drop in. A lot of times for certain Zooms, you have to be on a certain VPN. So I think like with bigger businesses, they'll have safer configuration. But if it's and schools should also have like an IT department that controls that. But with smaller businesses, that's definitely something that they should just get educated about, because it's not a hard fix.
Yeah, I think, me working in a media company, it's definitely something that we deal with a lot, because at the end of the day, like, selling ads is how we make money. And I think one thing that really needs to be addressed is to have the people, there's definitely some good steps being taken with things like GDPR, which is the European Union data protection laws, and CCPA, which is specific to California. I think in theory those things are really good, but they, at the end of the day, they were mostly written up by lawmakers and not tech people, which caused a lot of issues. When interpreting those laws, they were kind of rushed out the door, and we're trying to comply with all of them, and we would have to ask clarification on a lot of it, because it's like, okay, like, this doesn't really make sense. What do they mean? And then we get a team of lawyers, and they go and do the research, and they're like, we don't know what this means, and nobody kind of knows like exactly what the actionable things are. So I think it will be interesting to see how all of this privacy conversation develops. I think there's definitely some steps being taken, but we should just make sure that these laws are being written with a lot of like actual knowledge of how the tech industry works, because when lawmakers start to get too much into the tech, like you get into a lot of trouble. So for example, there's a bill that's trying to pass right now about encryption, and how like basically the government wants a backdoor into all of our communications. And I'm sure Veronica will know a lot more about this than I do, since she's in security. But basically, like, if you want to be like super simple about it, encryption is basically math. So you have 2 + 2 = 4, and what the government is saying is basically like, if we ask it, can 2 + 2 be 5? And it's like, no, like, it has to be like 2 + 2 is 4 for everybody. Like, if you make you can't make a backdoor for the government. Like, that's not how math works. Like, if you have a backdoor, you have a backdoor for everything. So that's what happens when, like, people that are not in the tech industry are coming up with these things. And, like, they're well intentioned. And, like, I'm sure that if you ask the people that are for it, they're like, like, think of the children, and like, like all the terrorists that we're going to kill by passing this type of law. But when you think about it in practice, there's like huge issues with it that, the average person and the average lawmakers have no idea about. So they just read the headline and, this thing will catch, predators and terrorists, and they say yes, but they don't know what it actually means.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really major point. I mean, you can feel about Facebook and Google how you will, right? I mean, there's a lot of debate going around about, data privacy and stuff like that. And there are a lot of opinions. Some are valid, some are not. I mean, I'm not an expert on it by any means. But what does really frighten me, I think, is this idea that we have lawmakers that have zero clue what they're talking about, and they're trying to like create legislation on this stuff. There was a pretty well publicized video a couple months, years, I forget how long it's been, honestly. But there was a video with Mark Zuckerberg sitting in front of Congress, and it was like, there were a series of questions. I can't actually remember what it was. I think one lawmaker, one congressperson actually asked Mr. Zuckerberg, how does your company make money? And it was like, what are you talking about? The reason why we're here is because we sell ads, right? And it becomes kind of frightening to realize that, like, we have on one end companies that, I mean, they do have a tendency to sell all your private information for the highest bidder, right? But on the other end, like, your best bet against these companies are people that actually have no idea what these companies do, right? So how do you solve the problem? I mean, how do you solve the problem without creating a boogeyman that doesn't actually exist and detract from an actual problem that does, right? It's a pretty open-ended question. I mean, I don't think anyone really has an answer because there's so many different interests at play right now. But having lawmakers that do understand what the entities in play that they are writing laws about, I think is the first step.
Or maybe not even like knowing all the full effects, but are willing to listen and learn. You know what I mean? Like, I don't expect lawmakers to know every detail of every industry, but if you're willing to listen to the experts, like, hey, this backdoor isn't a good idea. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's important as well. So what do you guys think about automation in the tech industry? Like, and how do you think it will affect the workforce? Like I said, both in the tech industry and businesses as a whole. Will it help it? Will it not? Like, I know a lot of people are worried, like, oh, lawyers are going to be replaced by automation and all this stuff. Like, what do you guys think about things like that?
I think specifically with lawyers, that's such a detailed field. Yeah. And I think even like one misconfiguration, like an error in like a data learning set could end up with someone in jail, right? Or there could be like so many factors in machine learning models. They have to like pick, like prioritize different factors. And there's a lot of like arguments for like different ways or techniques that work well. But some techniques just try and figure out like what's the most statistically significant without looking at the context. And so if you look at just like a systemic issue, you could say like, oh, more Black people like should, like, if someone's Black, then like you could have a higher chance of like being seen as guilty if you just have like a wrong data set. So I think that automation could help people, but there's always going to have to be lawyers, or there's always going to have to be analysts, or there's always going to have to be programmers, or hopefully like even like food service people, because automation has already taken over so many food service and retail jobs, which even after the pandemic are going to be more needed than ever. And so I think that automation should be used as a tool. Like, it's like math, right? Like, you know, you can use math to like look at like client salaries and stuff like that, or like look at certain things that like can help your case. And automation could really help with that, you know, like if you need to like quickly search a database, or if you need to like quickly organize like your cases, like that's really great, but there's always going to need to be a people component. And I think people kind of forget about that in their fears.
Yeah, I think that people look at machine learning and AI as this kind of black box, as Eduardo mentioned, and they kind of think it can do anything. It's some genie in a lamp that exists to solve all of humanity's problems and create all of humanity's problems as well, right? And I think it's kind of misconstrued. I think it's the equivalent of saying that as soon as you create the printing press, writers no longer exist, right? I mean, people still have to moderate what's happening. People still have to write the content. I think the most realistic thing is that it's sensationalism to a huge degree. I mean, don't get me wrong, there will be a lot of automation happening, and some jobs will get easier, which means that there'll be fewer people employed in that field, I would argue. But it really will be more of a tool to use rather than a catch-all kind of iRobot-esque kind of world, right? Yeah, I'm actually really excited about seeing how AI in particular will help people. I think automation will definitely thin, I think, the herd in some fields. I mean, maybe DevOps, I guess, in tech, right, for one thing. It's easier to automate certain parts of infrastructure. It's easier to automate certain things within it, right? But people still have to operate that. And like Veronica said, you know, one discrepancy could ruin a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think as a tool to augment what, you know, how we do our jobs, I think that's where AI and machine learning is really going to shine. So, for example, if you're a lawyer, instead of digging through a bunch of different books, the AI will give you, you know, hey, like, look here, and, you know, like, that's going to make that part of the job easier. You know, one good example is radiologists, for example. It's when you take a machine learning algorithm by itself, it's not as good as a radiologist at detecting certain things. But if you combine a radiologist with the assistance of machine learning, it's pretty much like 99.999% accurate, which is amazing. So like those types of things, I think will be really exciting to see. So like those types of jobs will really like be augmented in such a way that I think is going to be really exciting. In terms of, you know, like maybe like lower skill jobs, I think there's two ways of looking at it. I think we need to come up with a framework where, people have their needs taken care of. Like if we live in a world where you can't, you will always have the food that you need, and like you will always have shelter, and you'll always have your needs taken care of. I think that could accelerate automation a lot more, because you think of, places, for example, where the minimum wage was increased. You see a lot more development into, for example, like when McDonald's had to increase their minimum wage to $15 an hour in certain places, like they just replaced a lot of their workforce with like those automated kiosks, right? So I think in a lot of ways, the cost of labor being so low kind of hinders that type of automation. So I think if we get to a world where, everyone's needs are taken care of, I think that's going to accelerate automation in a way that is going to be really amazing. We'll get to a world where, you don't really need to be a cashier anymore. So you can, go to school instead and go into a profession where machine learning will help you and not replace you. So that's what I'm really excited for.
Yeah, that's awesome. You guys are great, and I see that we're running out of time, so I could literally sit here all night and talk to you guys and discuss these different things that are going on in our society, but I don't think you guys have the time for that. So I just wanted, if you guys are interested, if you guys want to give the audience your contact information so they could keep up with you and talk with you and maybe get some advice, like if they're interested in the tech industry and want that resource. So go ahead, guys, if you want to.
Hi, my LinkedIn is Veronica Weiss. It's exactly my name. My Twitter is execv. It's a syscall. And then GitHub is RMV8. Reach out on any of them if you have questions on the industry, on cybersecurity, on software development, on statistical methods and how that fits in with cybersecurity at all. And feel free to reach out whenever.
Yeah, I don't really have much of an online persona or anything, but yeah, if you have any questions, you can, hit me up on LinkedIn, Eduardo Dombrowiski on LinkedIn, and you can ask me anything.
Yeah, same. You can find me on LinkedIn. It's Surya-Duggirala. Happy to talk about anything tech related. Reach out.
That's awesome. Thank you guys. I think that's really important. Like that's one of the aspects I really want to focus on in this show is just connecting different people in different industries and helping other people as much as we can. So if you guys are already established in the industry, I think that's great to have you guys available to help other people. And even just talk about these things. I think it's very interesting. So thank you guys so much for being on the show. I really enjoyed it and I hope you guys did too. I hope the audience liked it as well and that you guys come back next week. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a great night. We'll see you next week for the next 2020.